Sweet, thank you. Welcome. How's everyone doing? Still good? Ready for coffee? So for the next 30 minutes, I'll take you through the world of Volar for a little bit, and I want to start with a little story. So when I went to university, you did not see that? So when I went to university a couple years ago, I had this professor that was like white-bearded, gray hair. You know exactly the kind of person that I'm talking about here, I assume. And he told me literally like, well, you know, you should really use Notepad++ so that you don't rely on tools like syntax highlighting and stuff when you learn to develop, right? Like very outdated way of thinking about things, but let's stick with it for a minute. So in preparation for my talk, I thought, okay, what if we didn't actually have tools like the Vue language server, for instance, when we would develop day-to-day applications with 90s tools. So one of the first things that people always think is like, well, the language server provides syntax highlighting, which is actually false. There are APIs in the language server protocol allowing for semantic highlighting, but truth be told, no one uses those. So instead, most syntax highlighting is either provided by text-made bundles, which is used in VS Code, or in WebStorm, we're using the AST natively. So I like to always make little fun of text-made because it's nothing but a fancy regex basically saying, oh, if you detect like style, then make CSS highlighting. It's a little dated, but whatever. The other thing that you don't have are all these fancy tools that you think you might have, like auto-completion, TypeScript integration, refactoring, auto-imports, documentation. All those things come from the language server itself. You still have formatting if you rely on Prettier or something, or ESLint has some kind of formatting too. But that's pretty much about it. So everything that we like using in our day-to-day work other than AI, we don't have. And having that said, a couple words about myself. I'm Niklas Wortmann. Hello, thanks for having me. I'm developer advocate at JetBrains, so I know a thing or two about developer tooling. Where's this pop-up coming from? No, I don't want to do an update. I'm also a member of the RxJS core team. I'm an Angular GDE. I just snuck into this conference. And I'm also running a newsletter, the Weekly Dev Brew. I maybe have a thing for coffee if you don't know that, so we can talk about that too if you want, but let's stick for Volar for now. Or not. So Volar is known as the engine under the hood that powers the Vue language server. Volar itself is much more than just a Vue language server, though, because Volar is also, for instance, used in Astro. We had Ian here last year, I think, talking about Astro. And there's so much more even that Volar powers these days, like MDX, Ember. Parts of our Angular integration are powered by Volar inside WebStorm. I know that the analog team is looking at Volar. So Volar itself is really more like a framework for building language server. And before we talk about that, like a couple of features that Volar brings out of the box, more or less, are all these things that you really, really like. The integration of like making a TypeScript-powered framework with Volar is very seamless. We will look a little bit how that looks later on, but you get all this feature more or less. It's probably like 20 lines of code, I would say, maybe 30. And because language server is such an arbitrary, abstract concept, like there are either those kind of people that work with developer tooling and language server and know exactly like the ins and outs, and there are normal developers that are just like, well, I want my dev tools to work. So I always talk a little bit about language server and the protocol itself, because the way this works is mostly you have a server that, in the case of the Vue language server, is part of the VS Code extension that you install, for instance. So you have a server binary that gets started, and then you have the IDE that talks with that server. So you have the IDE that ships the client, VS Code, WebStorm, whatever you use, and that talks over standard in and standard out with the server, either as part of the binary or whatever where it's coming from. And the message format looks kind of like this. So it's using JSON RPC under the hood. There's just more an implementation detail. It doesn't matter that much. It comes with a fancy ID that the language server can, or the client, can identify the requests. And then there are several methods that you can have. I picked an example here for text document completion, which is pretty much like you're saying console dot, and then you would expect like log to show up or info error, those things. In this case, it also, or in the case of text documentation complete, it also shares the file name, which is pretty common. Like most language server methods work on a file-by-file basis. And in this particular case, it's even like at the current position of the cursor, because you don't need to know other completion suggestions. The response would then look kind of like this. You have the ID again. Again, the client can say, oh, this is the one that I'm waiting for. Or there's even like cancellation mechanism. If you have already like typed in more characters in the meantime, it can toss those requests. And then there are the completion suggestions with fancy documentation, all the things that you might be looking for. So fairly straightforward. And I'll probably mess this up throughout the talk, so bear with me for a minute, but the terminology is kind of confusing because language server, LSP, and language server are all different things, but everyone uses them kind of the same. So the thing is, language server, or LSP, is language server protocol. So a language server implements the language server protocol. Make sense? Makes sense. And a language service is then an implementation for a certain language. So for instance, Volar ships a language service for HTML. The Vue language server uses the Vue language service to provide Vue support. I know it's complicated, and again, I'll probably mess this up, but that's theoretically how this interacts. And Volar comes with a lot of those services already out of the box. So here's the list that I hope is still complete. So it comes with CSS, Emmet, HTML, JSON, Markdown, Prettier, and Pretty HTML. It also comes with Pretty, I already had Pretty HTML. It comes with Puck, Beautify, Sass, TypeScript, 2/, and YAML, even though you shouldn't use YAML because it's the worst. Right after TypeScript enums, but close, very close. So the way that the Vue language server now works, if you look at the implementation, it's very lean. It's literally just saying, hey, this is how you parse a Vue SFC, and then divides all those files into HTML, CSS, TypeScript, and ships that to Volar, to the respective services. That's mostly it. You can also have like custom plugins if you want, but that's a different detail. So the Vue language server is really just a thin layer on top of Volar, if you want to think about it like that. And the important thing that the Vue language server does is really the parsing of the single file component, and then provides all those to Vue's code, WebStorm, whatever, NeoVim if you like. And the concept that is a little bit difficult to grasp, because we like single file component for like the nice developer experience that they provide. You have everything in one file, you know exactly where stuff is. But from like conceptually, a .vue file is at first not known. So what we need to look at here, and what also Volar and the Vue language server then does, is they have a virtual file representation. So each .vue file matches to a virtual .vue file that then gets split up into the TypeScript part, the HTML-ish part, because it's not native HTML with a mustache and stuff, and then also the CSS part. And taking away the scope, which is also not strict CSS, but you know that. So, and then we also have like funny things where we expect, for instance, TypeScript to work in the HTML part, in the script block, for instance. So HTML-ish is the best way to describe it. And so the language server, what it does is it divides this Vue file into 3 different files that then interact with each other. So we have the TypeScript part that we expect to be available in the HTML part. That is not a browser thing. Like if you have developed just like raw HTML, JavaScript, that's not a thing. That doesn't work like that. So what the Vue language server does here is providing the TypeScript context in the HTML file. But there are also other TypeScript features that you just expect to work. So for instance, if you have like a Vue component like this, besides the fact that it's not doing really anything, you expect certain things to work, right? You expect to have full control over TypeScript. You expect the interface to be declared and then used. You expect to define props to work, and when you use that component somewhere else, you expect the TypeScript context, as I mentioned. And all those things go hand in hand together here Oh yeah, and you also have optional chaining, which is another nice TypeScript feature that doesn't, depending on your browser version, doesn't even work. So there are also nice things like this. And again, as developers, we tend to be a little bit spoiled. I certainly am. So we basically, if we start working with something like that, we just expect all those things to work, completely ignoring the fact that there's like a shit ton of work involved. The thing that Volar excels at really is like this cross-file analysis. Particularly in like the TypeScript context, it's very important that you can reference the code from one file to another. Usually the LSPs as is really a file-by-file basis. And mostly even most actions and methods are available just at the position of the cursor. But you need to have this analysis that you know, hey, where is this view component coming from? That you can directly go to the definition, for instance. Those kind of things are really difficult for a language server to implement itself, and Volar did this in a really elegant way. We already heard Evan talk about this earlier, but there are several iterations over Volar that made it more performant. And also, they have a plugin architecture that makes it really nice for other frameworks to hook into it and build on top of it, like Astra did. Astra is still the best example for that. If you feel fancy and be like, oh, I want to really get into developer tooling, first, don't. Second, if you still want to do it, there's a VS Code extension called DevTools for Volar, or Volar Labs, which is really, really nicely because it actually shows you this different virtual files, and you can see how it's parsing, because the parsing is not fun. If you consider like trailing commas or like WSL, for instance, has a different representation for end-of-line carriers and those kind of things. It's absolutely not fun. And I also want to spend a couple minutes of how we use the language server within WebStorm, because I think that's kind of interesting compared to other models. Oh, there's a camera. So the way we use the language server in WebStorm, because we still use in our Vue plugin, we do use our LSP client. So WebStorm has a platform plugin API for LSP clients, and there we use the language server. The thing that we now do is we feed those information into our internal model that we have. We still do like native AST parsing of the single file component, because we still implement syntax highlighting, for instance, ourselves. So all those things get fed into our internal model that then at the end power existing features that we have for debugging, testing, documentation. And the interesting part of that is that we this way can also further provide refactorings. For instance, one thing that we do is if you refactor a CSS class name, it will automatically be in every file where it's referenced, which is a nice thing that we get for free by using our model. So having this hybrid mode of like having something or a lot of information coming from the LSP language server, having a lot of information coming from the language server, but also then have our internal model representing this allows us to build features on top of the language server in a very elegant way. For instance, we did that for Nux, the other release. I just don't exactly remember what we did, but we have some fancy Nux features. There's a lot of confusion. And from a marketing perspective, this was not the best way to phrase things, but there's this feature Volar thing going on, and it's still floating around a little bit. And it boils down more or less to the same with like takeover mode versus hybrid mode. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about that. The thing with feature, it's basically the Vue language server 1.x, right? So like the first major release of the Vue language server. The second major release of the Vue language server was named Volar, because in that transition also they extracted parts of the API into its own framework and used Volar under the hood there. But still, the Vue language server was called Volar, which I still confusing, because if you now Google Volar, you first get to the Vue language server. Under the hood, though, they fundamentally work different, very, very differently, because the takeover mode was basically an attempt to make the TypeScript language server, or to tackle performance issues with the TypeScript language server. So the way that takeover mode worked was basically, if you've checked the documentation, you know what I'm talking about, but it basically told you, hey, deactivate the TypeScript language server in VS Code, and feature or the Vue language server handles all requests from for the TypeScript language server, because under the hood it still used the TypeScript language server. So that was that. From a configuration aspect, it involved like a lot of manual steps. So that was kind of awkward from like a usability. And with Volar, the other approach they took, and that's also how a lot of other language server works these days, is they call it hybrid mode, where they still have like a little binary with like Vue-specific things, but most requests are getting directly shipped to the to the TypeScript language server, and the Vue language server is more of a plugin to the TypeScript language server. So with this plugin architecture, you basically tell the TypeScript language server, hey, if you get a .vue file, I can handle this for you. So this way, you did have the performance improvements in the case that you still have primarily one binary handling the TypeScript code, and therefore just one binary allocating the memory. But you also had an extensible architecture with this plugin architecture. And you didn't have the awkwardness with like takeover mode where you had to configure or manual things yourself. And because Johnson felt fancy and released the alpha for Volar 3 last week, one thing that is a little bit different to what I said here, it's like still primarily using the hybrid mode. It's really more of like the way the Vue language server binary and the TypeScript language server binary are still talking about. Because they used like a piping architecture, and now they, I think it's standard out, but I'm not entirely sure. So from like a user perspective, nothing really changed. From that aspect, it's more like a breaking change for IDEs, because they need to, the way the messaging forwarding is handled is now different. Okay, we talked now a lot about like Volar, Vue language server, this, that. I do want to give you like a little bit more code, because we are developers, we like looking at code. So the way you would build your own language server, again, if you feel fancy, with Volar, the way this basically works is, and there's a starter template that is great for getting started. You're basically establishing the connection and creating the server that then listens to input-output. Again, you obviously need to have like a client integration with that. This is just the server part. So the client integration with VS Code is 10 lines of code. The client integration with JetBrains IDEs is 10 lines of code. There are GitHub repositories for all of that. Just check those out. But looking at the language server again, this is how you start the server itself. The other part that you then would need is within that initialization logic is saying, okay, what do I want to handle? And in our particular case, we're registering a language plugin. So we are now saying, okay, I don't want to, HTML is kind of outdated, so let's make a new HTML. And in our new HTML, the way this works is we say what language ID we have, so all .html1 files get redirected to this language server or get handled by this language server. And the part that I didn't write down here because it's unnecessarily complex is how the file would be parsed. So the splitting up into the virtual files, that is the, no, I don't have a slide for that. I thought so. So the way this works would basically be like looking for script tag and saying, oh, the script part, that is TypeScript code. The template part, that is HTML code. The styles, that is CSS. And then you have like 3 different virtual files out of that the language server can interact with. Good? So talking a little bit about the future of Volar. One thing I think that is interesting is that Johnson relentlessly tries to make the language server faster in various approaches. So all the major version changes are always performance improvement. Using alien signal, for instance, as Evan told us before, is a way to make the performance improvement work. Obviously, the TypeScript language server gets a nice improvement now with the Go implementation. Actually, funny story with that, the TypeScript language server is not a language server. It's not implementing it's also written in the blog post, the TypeScript language server is not implementing the LSP, because the TypeScript language server was older than the LSP. So it's kind of like a baseline. There are similarities, but it's not quite working the same. But the nice thing is now the new TypeScript language server is going to be an LSP, which is going to make the work for Volar a lot nicer as well. I'm pretty sure there are more integrations coming from. I'm, for instance, talking to the folks from Knip, the JavaScript library that detects like unused files. Great library if you haven't used it, by the way. And they are looking for an implementation with a language server based on Volar. If Johnson ever decides to raise VC money, he should think about making it AI-powered because that's the way to go these days, apparently. The thing that I really love about Volar is that it's such a fundamental baseline for developer tooling. So if you want to develop something yourself, like Vine, for instance, Volar is a great way to get this started without like going full-blown, oh, I need to do like developer tooling, like in the holistic way. It's a great baseline to get a wide range of support, more or less out of the box. And with out of the box, I mean within like 30, 50 lines of code. I do like this slide so much because I got very excited about like this talk. It's like a topic that I feel passionate about. But I totally acknowledge that just because I feel passionate about it doesn't mean everyone else does. So I probably worked on this next section more than on the rest of the talk. And the thing that I came up with why I think you should care about things like Volar basically boiled down to this concept. And or this quote from Galileo, if we ignore the unnecessary use of gendering here in this quote because different times, but it basically says you cannot teach a man anything, you can only help him find it within himself. So with this talk, I mostly hope that I shared my passion for developer tooling a little bit and kind of sparked that curiosity in you, hopefully. And if you ever feel passionate enough to be like, oh yeah, developer tooling, I'm going to work on developer tooling, Volar is a great way to start this, with sticking in your ecosystem and giving you like a nice head start. So having all that said, thank you very much.